This is E&P Reports from Editor and Publisher Magazine, the authoritative voice of news media since 1884, serving newspapers, broadcasts, digital, and all multimedia news publishing. And greetings once again, Mike Blinder, publisher of E&P Magazine. I am committed to do housekeeping first. If you're listening to me on whatever flavor of podcast channel you enjoy, please follow us. Watching on YouTube, there is a subscribe button below me, a bell to the right. Smash that thing, you'll get an update each and every time we upload a new episode of E&P Reports. I am honored to have Chris Stirewalt on our show today. Chris, may I call you Chris, Mr. Stirewalt?
Sure, of course.
You've written a new book. I was watching you being interviewed by Mika on Morning Joe. I've heard of the book, Broken News, Why the Media Rage Machine Divides America and How to Fight Back. I got my copy a few days ago and I'm plowing through it. But if I may be so bold, sir, I mean, there are certain moments that define certain individuals in history. When Howard Dean stood on that stage and went, woo, or Barnacle interviewed libertarian Gary Johnson and asked about the crisis in Aleppo, and Gary Johnson said, what is Aleppo? You, sir, and maybe you disagree, will be defined as the man on Fox News who called correctly Arizona during the election. And that just... does it upset you that is the number every time someone interviews you now, every time someone mentions your work, and it's tremendous, work in our industry, you'll be defined as the guy that said, hey, Arizona, first to do it, has gone to Joe Biden. Does that in some way upset you that people think of that moment in time?
Well, I mean, I think it's important in our vocation not to think about that kind of stuff. That who knows what else will happen in my career after this. My career, such as it is. And by the way, I didn't call Arizona. We had a great decision desk team that called Arizona. I was privileged to defend our call of Arizona, and am proud of it to this day. If there's one thing, if there was going to be one thing that people thought about my career being associated with that correct call, that would not be a bad thing. That would be okay. But again, don't worry about that stuff, because if you start thinking about legacy while you're a working journalist, you're going to screw things up.
There's a pull quote, or one of many, I'm sure, in the next 30 minutes of our journey. So we're going to have a conversation with Chris Stirewalt, Senior Fellow at American Enterprise Institute, also contributing editor and weekly columnist for The Dispatch. Obviously, before joining, you were at Fox News Channel. You were obviously their political editor and famous for that work, but you've also been a political editor in legacy media as well. We're going to chat about your book and your opinions of the media industry and news media in general on the backside of this message.
This episode of E&P Reports is sponsored by IQ Audience Plus by Town News. Consumer revenue has never been more important. Digital leaders at media organizations worldwide are asking the same question. How do we accelerate the growth of consumer revenue? Traditional one-size-fits-all paywalls aren't the answer. They're blunt instruments that treat all visitors the same way, costing you money. IQ Audience Plus by Town News is a smart, dynamic metering solution that empowers you to maximize revenue by identifying key audiences, seeding engagement, and growing membership and subscriptions. Ready to supercharge your consumer revenue, grow engagement, and bolster your advertising income? Visit townnews.com/EP today to learn more about IQ Audience Plus by Town News.
Chris, the first thing I liked about your book was that you in a way remind me a little of myself, that I feel like I'm a closet historian. I look at the world through history. My wife always jokes with me that I live in the past. I'm always watching and studying, and I read so much about history. And you talk about how media has always been biased. It's not. I mean, do you not even discuss the American Revolution in a way, or how when someone is a journalist in reporting, they're not an algorithm. They have opinions, and publishers have opinions, and media has opinion. So it's not new for us to have biased media today. I mean, do you agree with that?
No, of course not. And in a lot of ways, the bubble that inflated between, let's say, Pearl Harbor and the fall of Saigon, or the whatever point in the 1970s where it was fully burst, was the idea that there could be a journalism that was perfectly objective, that was perfectly dispassionate, was while well-intentioned, that doesn't happen, right? There is no such thing as pure objectivity. We can talk about commodity news, and if we can just step back a little bit farther, most of human history was marked by the struggle for people to get basic information, right? Just as it was. So really, if you think about it, until the 1840s, probably, getting information was hard. The arrival of the telegraph and the arrival of the locomotive changed dramatically the way people relate to each other and relate to information. But all along the way, there has never been any evidence that outside of, again, very commoditized, basic wire service kind of news, the score, the temperature, the date and time and place. Outside of that stuff, of course, the publisher, the editor, the writer, the people working in the newsroom, all of those people are shaping what's coming. So there is never going to be pure objectivity because, as I tell young reporters, you're like a juror. You bring yourself to your work. Now that's the objectivity question. And I don't think striving for perfect objectivity is a good use of time, but a really good use of time is striving for fairness. And I use the term aspirational fairness because we know that there will be implicit biases. We know that there are long overlooked communities, long overlooked groups inside a society that went unnoticed and unseen for a long time by the news business. We know all of this is true and we will always fail, but it's still a good thing to try for. It's still a good goal for me to have as a journalist.
Well, okay, so let's look back on the role of journalism in our society. I always say that a bunch of imperfect men wrote a perfect document a few hundred years ago where they saw a need to make sure there was a free, unfettered press as a final check on power. And that shining light of the truth to a populace is what makes us a perfect, supposedly, union democracy, republic, whatever. Then let's go to 1927. There was a Radio Act that started to frame the idea of equal time. You know what I mean? That if someone were to go on broadcast and say that have an opinion, there should be an opposing opinion. Then Federal Communication Commission backed it up. But during the Reagan era, things got a little wonky, and you can even get into Dick Cheney's role in all this. And suddenly things like Rush Limbaugh. I mean, I was a radio guy for years. I started as a disc jockey, and I programmed radio stations and ran radio groups. And we loved Rush Limbaugh, not because we cared about his leaning right or left. We loved because he was resurrecting an AM band and finding audience. And we didn't want to offer equal time back then. We were okay with the FCC. I used to lobby in Washington as the president of the main broadcasters for this with Bill Cohen and George Mitchell. In other words, what I'm saying, have we gone so far now that we have to look back on the whole ecosystem that we have created in broadcast, and that includes cable as well? And what is opinion and what is news?
Well, the FCC's history of regulating speech leaves a lot to be desired. And we look, so there's a midpoint between the formation of the FCC and what you talk about getting wonky with the fairness doctrine. So in the through the mid 60s, the first Kennedy and then Johnson administrations really wanted to crack down on very popular right-wing radio hosts that were what was his name? I didn't know I would have to visit this part of my brain today.
I know it's hard to go back and come up with this.
So there were several right-wing, sort of John Birch adjacent, but who were really ripping into the administration. So using tax code, Justice Department, FCC, they went after these broadcasters and shut them down and brought in a new concept of basically what the fairness doctrine, as understood post Johnson, let's say, is shy away from political discourse because you're just going to get yourself into trouble, right? If you have political discourse on your broadcast, facility, you're going to have the other side, and who gets to say the other side? You might get fined and you might get whatever. So they put political content, you know why we have Sunday shows, because it's a holdover from the broadcast era, where in order to qualify for your FCC licensure, you had to have a certain amount of public affairs broadcasting, which used to be very boring and very serious.
The news used to be a nuisance to the networks at the time. Got to do this for fairness. We got to do
right.
But inform the public, right?
So I don't think that it was the fairness doctrine or the Reagan administration, any changes to the fairness doctrine under the FCC in the 1980s or 1990s. The Rush Limbaugh phenomenon is obvious, and you're quite right. But I think what really happened was that in the mid-1990s, and a lot of it was arranged around the Clinton impeachment, but in the mid to late 1990s, you had the arrival of Fox News, you had the arrival of the internet as a useful means of communication for large numbers of Americans, and you have, more than any of those things maybe, cable news starts, not cable news, cable television in general becomes hyper dominant in the media space. So, there are a lot of things that killed local newspapers, but I like to point out to people that Americans did not reach their peak consumption of hours of television a day until 2010 and 2011, when it was almost 9 hours of television per day per household on average. And what that tells us is the profusion of choices and the end of broadcast, right? Now broadcast, schmodcast, right? It doesn't matter whether it's broadcast, how it comes in through the pipe doesn't matter. What matters is that there's this massive profusion of choices. And when the massive profusion of choices enters the marketplace, and it is coupled with the devastation that, starting with Craigslist, wrought on the newspaper business, there's a big vacuum. There's this giant vacuum, and you have all of these small players trying to get in and hold on to their little piece of the market. And the best way to get there is to make people afraid, to make people angry, to keep them afraid, to keep them angry, and to engage in a term I did not coin, but I think is very apt, which is post-journalism. In journalism, we have information and we want to give it to you, right? We have it and we think that we can make a profit by getting you that information. In post-journalism, you have a feeling. The audience has an emotional bent. They have an ideological bent, an emotional bent. So how do you capture that audience? By mirroring the feeling back to them. So instead of being a top-down information, it is a bottom-up emotional engagement. And it's how you can make a profit with audiences that are much, much smaller. Because let's step out of news for a second. Think about Netflix. I don't know when the Emmys are, but I know we're somewhere around the Emmys. And I saw a story about how Squid Game was going to win all of these Emmys because it was a very popular Netflix show. How many people watched Squid Game compared to how many people watched an episode of Magnum PI in 1985 or whatever the number one show was in the mid 1980s? It's a fraction, right? It's
much smaller. It's all niche now. It's niche.
And the loss of a common culture that we see in our entertainment media is also reflected in our news media.
It's funny because, I actually read books about this, like in the 60s, the 50s and 60s, the Lucy show had a 60 million audience. You don't even find anything close to that anymore. And that was one thing that binded America. No matter which way you leaned or which sports team you supported, we all watched Lucy the night before. Right. So we all felt some kinship to something common. Those days are gone. But I want to stay at 50,000 feet and stay in this discussion of the news ecosystem that you were part of. But you almost teased where I want to end our journey, which is about local journalism, because that's something you and I both have a passion for. And thank you when you actually complimented Morning Joe and said, oh, you didn't say what I would have said. You complimented them because they always refer to local newspapers and local journalism. But what happened to the papers on the table? They got to come back, in my opinion. They used to have them stacked there. And they're gone now. And how dare you? At least could you'll show them. But anyway, let's stay in your world there, because what I love what you just said. I call it, or many have now called it, the echo chamber of Fox is not informing a populace. It's informing its own audience over and over and over again and fanning the flames of that anger in order to build revenue and audience. But doesn't MSNBC do the same thing? I mean,
Yeah.
I mean,
And so does the Washington Post. And so does, and look, the point of this book is I would love for everybody to do a better job. I think we all know that things are not going in the right direction when we see the Pew and Knight research on what Americans think about their news. We know that and people in our industry know too. While we may have higher regard for ourselves, not surprisingly, we know that there is a serious problem here and that we are not serving the interests of the Republic. And that's good. It's good that we are aware of that. And what is too tempting, and the reason I really hate media criticism and hope that I'm glad I wrote the book. I think it was, I'm glad it's so successful. I'm glad about a lot of that, and I'm glad about the reception that it's getting. But I'd rather talk about politics. I'm a political forecaster and analyst. That's what I do. That's my jam. Right. Journalistic media criticism. My joke about media criticism is it's like asbestos abatement. It's dangerous. It's hazardous, or it's hazardous, it's complicated, and you should leave it to the professionals. Like, let the guys in the hazmat suits go in, because so much of media criticism is just this negative partisanship by other means. If you go on CNN and talk about, or in the old CNN, and to talk about how bad Fox is, or you go how bad CNN is, you're not talking to anybody, right? The Venn diagrams don't overlap. So what Brian Stelter was saying about Fox, no Fox watchers were hearing. Exactly. And what Fox and Friends was saying about Brian Stelter, nobody on CNN was hearing. And it is an echo chamber, but it is also, look, it is possible now. But so let's use the analogy you talked about, how we've always had biased news. So the newspapers after the American Revolution were abominably partisan. They were shockingly, rottenly partisan. But they were also pretty hard to get. It'd be pretty hard if you could get a newspaper, even if you were a middle-class family. It was expensive, and it might be hard to get if you didn't live in a pretty major city. The Post Road doesn't get completed to South Carolina until pretty late in the game, right? It's pretty late in the game. So in those days, bias was definitely part of what was going on, right? The papers themselves were funded by political parties. However, if you were a Democratic Republican and the only paper you could get was a Federalist newspaper, you would have read the Federalist newspaper, right? And if you were a Federalist, the only paper you could get was a Democrat, you'd read that one. These are what we have today are demand side problems substantially, and they're demand side problems that are created by superabundance, much like our obesity epidemic, much like the massive wave in opioid addiction. These are problems of affluence. These are problems of we have defeated the age-old problem of getting people enough information. And now it's taking us quite a while, but not that long. And when you get to the chapter about the radio, you'll see not that long by historical standards for smartphones and decentralized media for us to get good at using it.
You tell a story in the book, which I think back to 2010, right? And you're sitting at a meeting, and this is from your book, where Roger Ailes, and you were chatting. By the way, is it just me, or every time I think of Roger Ailes, I see John Lithgow's face? I don't know why, from that famous movie.
Lithgow was pretty good, but I think the Russell Crowe version was actually a little closer to the truth. But yes, I know exactly what you mean. But
Roger Ailes, good or bad, right or wrong, and I'm not going to even insert the word diabolical, was a genius. I mean, amazingly how he put together this very, very profitable thing. But basically, he looked at you and said, how many seats will this is 2010 now. We're talking way back, but the Republicans grab, and you predicted, I think, what was the number, 64, and the actual number became 63. He got angry with you because some of the pundits that were appearing on the evening entertainment shows were saying it's going to be 100, and the audience was drinking that in and loving it, and he didn't want you I guess to put vinegar in the Kool-Aid. Am I saying right? And that's
I don't know that he was angry. He was definitely messing with me. I don't know where. I don't know how much he was. I don't know how much of it was messing with the new guy and how much of it was this. The person he referenced, Dick Morris.
Oh, Dick Morris. That's right. Mm-hmm.
Was by that time already kind of a joke. So I don't know, but it was certainly a moment where, coming from the newspaper business, and I have just started in television, and I don't fit in. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to do this. I'm down, and I better hope that I'm right. What I observed, though, is that it had been good for Dick Morris to overestimate the number of seats that Republicans might win, because it got him booked on Sean Hannity. And it was good for Sean Hannity for Dick Morris to project that it would be 100 seats, because that's what Republicans like to hear. That sounded even better. If the number 60, which is huge, 100's got to be better than 60, right? That's 40 more. So
1,000. Go ahead.
That kind of boosterism is popular with viewers, just like right now. Which would rate better on MSNBC? A segment in which I went on and said, Democrats think they're on the comeback in the midterms, but here's 5 reasons why they're actually going to lose the Senate, and that the Republican House majority may be bigger than you think.
Too depressing. I don't want to hear that.
Right.
That would depress me. You can't tell me that, right?
If I have that segment, what's going to be more popular? That, or the segment where I say it's even better than we thought for Democrats? We knew that the environment was improving for Democrats, but now, lo and behold, they're going to actually hold the House and they're going to gain seats in the Senate. Which one of those two would rate better? And it's not like it's no mystery.
But see, this is what I found fascinating, because Roger Ailes knew that he should have journalism during the day, and that the evening was just entertaining. In a way, at least the books I read about, the building of this network, that was kind of the model. You were part of the journalistic side he was talking to, and you were referring, I think, is this why you brought this anecdote up, that the evenings were just jokes? I mean, it's just stuff going on the network with the same network bug on the screen, with an audience that thinks they're watching news. Is that what your point was on this thing?
Now, if I wrote a book about Fox News,
okay,
it would make people who watch MSNBC feel better. If I wrote a book about MSNBC, it would make people who watch Fox News feel better. And the point of this book is not to make anybody feel better. I don't want anybody to say. I went on to do an interview with a guy one time, and basically the point that he wanted to make in the interview was that he was a better journalist than Sean Hannity. And I said, well, congratulations, you've done it. You have arrived. Kudos to you, sir. So I have to be careful not to let this book or my work be a cudgel for one side to use against the other side. I have to know that the work I started in newspapers when I was 17 years old. I love the news business. I love working in the news business. I am passionate about the news business. I have devoted my professional life to it, and particularly political news. And the condition of political news reporting in the United States stinks. It's bad. Yeah. It's really bad. And the reasons that it's bad is that we got the chocolate in the peanut butter, right? Your belief, your point of view in life is your belief and your point of view in life. I have my own beliefs. I have my own point of view in life. I think about things a certain way. I'm a human being. I have kids. I think about the future. But when I come to do analysis, I have to take that part as best I can. Like I say, aspirationally fair. I have to take that part out. And there are a lot of great political journalists working today. Steve Kornacki at MSNBC.
Amazing. Fantastic. I try to dress like him every time I can now. Khakis, the white shirt,
Can
I ask you, on that point, because it's my show and I can do whatever the hell I want. Do you feel that the guy CNN is bringing on to try to be a Kornacki could be a Kornacki? They have some guy now that they bring in to get to the board and do the numbers. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Well, maybe you mean Harry Enton.
Is that who? Yes, Harry.
Yeah. I love Harry. Harry, like Steve, is a friend of mine and a really good guy.
Yeah.
And Harry knows what's up. And I can guess maybe what Steve or Harry might think politically a little bit, but I don't even try, because what I want is their analysis, right? I want their analysis.
You want the numbers and what they mean.
And I want to know what's going to happen, because for me, the point of political journalism is I love America, and therefore I have to love Americans. And I need to know them, and how many there are, and where they are, and what they're doing, and how they're living, and what's going on. And these elections that we have provide not only a testing moment to see where the country is, but the vehicle by which I can know so much. Political demography, even if we never had an election, the political demography of this country and how people think and how they feel and where they're moving and what they're doing is this wonderful story. It's this amazing story of the most amazing country in the world. And for me, that's what political journalism is a doorway into.
Precisely.
But if what we do is mix that up with, how about this? If I'm the weatherman, I'm not rooting for the hurricane, but I am trying to tell you which trailer parks it's going to hit. But if we measure, and there's actually great stuff on this that, why am I drawing a blank on his name? Michael Lewis talked to the guy who was the #1 tornado expert in Alabama and had been for decades. This guy's the local news institution, local TV station, I guess, in Birmingham. And he talked about how much less people have confidence in him and how much more he gets attacked now about his forecasts, and that his work is questioned. And the reason, in part, is too much specificity. 40 years ago, when people were talking about an election, there was a little bit of soothsaying to it, right?
Yeah.
There were the auguries and the chicken bones in the pod, and like, well, we're seeing interesting things. A lot of yard signs out there, or well, if it rains on election day, that'll be good for so and so. So there were all of these old pre-data kinds of information that we relied on, and people who, my predecessors in this work, there was a decent bit of malarkey that had to be involved, because in the end you were just saying, well, we don't know that much. Now voters get a false sense of a depth of knowledge, and what we saw starting at the 2000 election certainly is a hinge point. That's where we get red states and blue states. That's where polling obsession, poll averages, hour by hour polling upon polling upon polling upon polling, and news producers, but certainly news audiences, especially when you can go and click your map 10,000 times, 10 different ways, I think started to accept a degree of accuracy and a degree of predictivity that would just not be possible. And then
I hear you.
Then that backfired.
All right. So we only have about 10 minutes left in this dialogue, and this is amazing. I first want to make sure the audience understands, in no means do I want anyone who is about to run to Amazon, you don't run to Amazon, I guess you click on Amazon, to buy Broken News, Why the Media Rage Machine Divides America and How to Fight Back is a tell-all book. It is not. You didn't write it that way. It talks about how the news business is so tilted right now, correct me if I'm wrong, and that we're just, preaching to our own choirs and just trying to please the audience. News is coming from the ground up rather than shining that spotlight, the Scripps logo, of what's really supposed to be heard. Now, but what I loved about your interview with Mika, because that's why I asked you to be on this program, because I was watching Morning Joe, and my wife, actually I was listening to it. I was in the bathroom, and my wife, I heard about it. I said, because you start talking about local journalism and the value of local journalism and why it's important that it survives. And that's where ENP is right now. We are all over what's going on in Congress. I don't look at the Washington Post, our editorial team, or the New York Times or CNN or Fox News as the journalism we have to cover. That's just big, huge entertainment sources. Okay, for example, when we had on this very program, the management team, the editorial management team, the Star Tribune, that covered George Floyd, they won a Pulitzer for that. And remember, they had to do this remotely. And then during the crisis that was going on in their city, they had to have lawyers involved and worry about wearing vests to protect themselves as they were covering it. And I asked them the question, I said, how did you guys keep your heads to the ground and cover this with all the stuff going on cable news during this? And the senior editor said these words, go check it out. He said, what's cable news? We don't watch it. We don't care. It is not part of our world. It's never discussed in our newsroom. So maybe our world talks so much about that because that's just so much out there. Just doing, every time Donald Trump tweets, ratings go up. I mean, it's amazing. Let's talk about local journal. You started in West Virginia, right? You
That's
came,
right.
And
so I entered the full-time vocation of journalism at the end of the end of the age. I arrived in 1997. Right as the Earth as we knew it was about to stop on its axis for newspapers. Right. And
those were the big days where they were building bigger press plants.
Right, 23 readership was down, but advertising revenue was up, and it rocked.
And we owned jobs, we owned cars, we owned homes. Half of our revenue was just inserts and classifieds. We were just a distribution machine back then. Yes.
And print revenue in the print advertising revenue in the United States did not peak until 2005. So there was still a little juice left up to the top of the mountain. But the trip from, I forget, I think it was $55 billion or something, down to almost nothing, down to the loss of $50 billion or so, only took a few years. So I came into a news business that was over leveraged because profits were so predictable. You could always borrow money to buy more. And they were conglomerating and agglomerating and breaking up and then coming back together. And there's always a new group coming in to buy another million newspapers and do all this stuff. Well, what it meant was that when revenue got cut, when the competition started, they didn't have any wiggle room because they were so leveraged on the basis of these permanent profits. And that's when the cutting began. And as you said, if you think of yourself primarily, and I think this was my experience at the newspapers where I worked, what I did was stuff that I talk about this in the book. What I did was stuff that went around car ads, right? What I did was stuff that went, in the ownership of the newspaper's mind, what I did was something that went around ads for mulch for the garden show. And and of course, they viewed themselves as being in the printing business. That was primary. Those big machines are cool, and you've got fleets of trucks, and it smells like newsprint, and it's awesome. And then we're some nerds sitting around clacking at keyboards, sucking up free coffee. And
me,
and they didn't see where the actual value was.
No.
And as a consequence, they cut newsrooms, and we know about the tens of thousands of newsroom jobs that were wiped out in the country in the last decade.
Well, and the hedge funds haven't helped over the past few years either.
Well, so now we've got to.
Well, think about your market in West Virginia. Think about think about that town. Think about what that town would be without a voice in a Madisonian democracy. Check on power. I mean, that's what's scary right now. Don't you agree that without that voice?
So what came in when it collapsed was, Tip O'Neill's famous old saying, all politics is local, is not true anymore. Now all politics are national. And part of the reason that all politics are national is that into the void that was created by the cutting and the slashing and burning throughout the local news business came low quality national political news.
Precisely.
Because there's just not that much. There are not that many things that are news for the whole country. People who don't live in the Northeast corridor are mystified every winter when there's 3 days of coverage about a blizzard that 80% of Americans did not experience any part of.
As long as there's good art, right? As long as there's great video, we're going to throw it out there.
So there's just not that much quote unquote national news. There isn't. So, and the only thing that really is, think about it this way. There's only one office that is nationally elected in the entire United States, and that's the presidency. So a big part, by the way, of why our government is so screwed up is how much our media coverage personifies the government and personifies the American experiment in the person of one president. And it's too much. But all of this focus on national political news then gives way to the next easiest part, which is what? Culture war news is easier. Personalities and emotions are easier to do than the hard news, because the hard news requires you to spend money. You have to do investigative journalism. You have to have a lot of stories that don't pay off. It's a real pain. It's really complicated. What's easy to do is have somebody write a piece that says, we're smart and they're dumb. Here's 5 tweets that prove why we're good and they're bad. Here's a listicle of 10 things that make the other side evil and dispatriotic. That stuff is easy. It scratches the news consumer's itch. And now when local news tries to come back, and the struggle, which I see a lot of hope for, but in the struggle, now it is farm to table having to fight back against fast food chains that have wiped out the food ecosystem in their communities.
But luckily, I mean, you likely agree with this, that crisis accelerates change. COVID switched a whole mess of consumers' minds that local news is essential, because COVID was local. And we have research now and that's why newspapers have more readers today than they ever had in their history. The digital audiences grew massively. This is a time, in my opinion, where we have to circle back and support what keeps us alive as a democracy. So I have to ask you now, as we get near the end, you have some suggestions, do you not, on what could solve these problems? We've discussed in the last 35 minutes the problems in our society, but you got it. You got from 3,000 to 4,000 news publishers are our audience. Most of them are in audio. They're not going to see your face. But tell me, what would you suggest now in today's ecosystem? We have Congress working on legislation, as you know, Journalism Sustainability Act, the Safe Harbor Bill. We're doing everything to get Google and Facebook to pay up. We're trying to find ways. And what is the solution to help us get through this?
Well, no one is coming to help us. No, there will be no external force that will come from outside of our midst to make us the kind of news producers and consumers that we should be. This is an inside job. A republic is like a family. It exists when people want it to. I've had way too much cause to quote Abraham Lincoln's Young Men's Lyceum speech in the past several years. But what he said then is as true now as it was 25 years before the Civil War, which is either we will endure for all time as a nation of free men, or we will die by suicide. And both options are still perfectly available to us. I think what we see January 6th. I think what we see in violence in the streets, I think what we see with the anxieties around the electoral process, Americans coming to terms with the fact that we cannot afford to keep doing what we're doing. The legislation in Congress, I'm not up to date on to the degree that I should, so I'll say this. I think antitrust carve outs for news organizations are great. I think subsidies are bad because I think you end up subsidizing stuff that doesn't work. The urgent need.
But then you could also have government intervention in we have to be unfettered. You can't have government, because it's already been proven on the state level. We have states right now that will pull back advertising dollars from universities if they don't like the political lean. Here in Florida, our governor, you have heard of the Florida governor that I'm
aware. Yes.
He actually got rid of all the public notices in the newspapers because he was upset with one reporter at the Miami Herald. I mean,
that's right. So you can't. So subsidy is even
it's not on
subsidy like that is not a good
idea. You can't
idea.
license journalism. I mean, you got to.
Amen.
Right.
Amen. But what my book says, what I say, is that it will begin with me, and that I as a journalist have special obligations. You as a journalist have special obligations to the Constitution because of the extraordinary freedoms that we are given to do our work. And that means that when we do our work, that we know that we can't engage in work that is intentionally harmful to the nation. And a lot of people every day to make a living in this country, thousands of journalists know every day, is this really good for the country? Is this show really good for the country? Is this good? Is this mean-spirited post that I'm about to put up shredding this other person to smithereens, or being insincere or being cynical? Is this good? And we have to know that there are places that we as individual journalists just will not go, that we cannot. There is no American journalism without Americanism. And the work that I do, and this would be true of any vocation that we were in, but it's particularly true of this one because of, as we talked about before, the special connection between a free press and a healthy republic. So we know that's true. But it's also true that every American citizen has a different obligation around news than they do with other things that they consume, because you can't be a good citizen if you're not a well-informed citizen. So you owe your neighbor, out of a sense of filial love, out of the philos, right? That you owe your neighbor, out of that filial love that is connected to your love of country, that you must be well-informed. And that means hearing things that don't make you happy sometimes. The difference between news and entertainment is that in the news business, sometimes we have to tell you what you don't want to hear. And if you as a consumer feel really great about your news, if everything that you hear, you say, yep, I'm right again. I'm right. I've done it again. I'm correct. I'm good in their bed. So that's why you have to have a varied diet so that you will be made uncomfortable sometimes, so that you will hear things that do not align with your worldview.
And that's in your title, because you called the book Broken News: Why the Media Rage Machine Divides America and How to Fight Back. And that's how you fight back. You have to be able to, that famous speech from American president where he says, you got to let the person who's screaming at the top of their lungs, you got to hear those words. You don't have to agree with them, but you have to acknowledge the dualism of our society. Chris Stirewalt, senior fellow at AEI, once again at American Enterprise Institute. For those of you that don't know, it's a right-wing DC think tank that believes in the things that made me a Republican. By the way, private enterprise, limited government, and democratic capitalism. I was a Joe Scarborough Republican. I must ask you now, sir, are you still? You don't have to tell me where you lean. Have you been on Fox News? Will they let you on? Are you still a Republican? Or they are?
I don't know that I've ever been a Republican. I certainly don't affiliate politically. That would be really bad for my work.
With what's going on today. But
no. To affiliate, so if you affiliate politically, if I try to do my work. So let's say this: if you asked me to write a piece about who is going to win the World Series, I am a St. Louis Cardinals fan. It would be impossible for me to be a St. Louis Cardinals fan and then correctly analyze what was going to go on. And instead, you'd get a big bunch of homerism from me about how great Albert Pujols is and how wonderful it is to see Yadier Molina and Adam Wainwright become the battery with the most starts in baseball history. I would write that whole piece and it would be mostly useless. So if I think of myself as a Republican, or if I think of myself as a Democrat, or if I think of myself as for this, or I think of myself as for that, I create a permission structure.
But you were with the Examiner, then you went to Fox News, and now you're with AEI. So in a sense, you're saying, I love this. You're saying I can be an impartial journalist, even though I'm working for entities that lean towards the right in the political discourse of our society.
The good thing, AEI, you mentioned AEI. The great thing about AEI is that it is free. It is a place for free thought. It's a place for free inquiry. We just brought on my new colleague, Rui Teixeira, who wrote The Emerging Democratic Majority with John Judas in 2003, one of the great Democratic political demographers of all time. So I don't worry. Look, I don't care how people vote. Everybody ought to vote however they want to, shoot the lights out, do whatever. What I do care about is that as people go through the political process, that they bring sincere love of country with them as they do it. I don't care what Congress does. I care that Congress works through the Constitution. The problem that we have now is not ideological. The largest problems we have now are not ideological. They are transpartisan problems that are related to weak institutions. And the institution that I urgently want to see restored is the news industry, and that requires local news at its base as the pediment for a stronger version of that. So that's what I care about. And then people can go vote however they want to vote.
We'll leave it at that. Broken News: Why the Media Rage Machine Divides America and How to Fight Back is everywhere. Just type in Chris Stirewalt into Google. You'll find the book. I'm halfway through. I should finish it by the end of the month. By the way, I wrote a book back in 2008, and I always joke that if I sign it, it's worth less. So,
No,
I'm not going to ask you to. But anyway, it's an honor and pleasure, sir. I hope you'll stay in touch with us at ENP and keep up the good fight. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.